Paula Schaefer, you are the director of Safe Harbor's trainings, right?
Safe Harbor Training Coordinator.
Safe Harbor Training Coordinator. And you thought I wasn't going to screw that up. So thank you. Paula Schaefer has 30 years of experience in this business, and I've already been to a couple things she's put on, and she has very much impressed me, so I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Thank you for taking the time on a beautiful summer day to be here. I see some faces, people that I've seen in previous trainings that I've been a part of, so I'm glad to see you. But let me ask, I'll tell you just a little bit more. My experience has been primarily in juvenile justice and child welfare system. Most of my direct care service has been with kids who have been swept into the juvenile justice system, residential treatment centers, detention centers, and crisis intervention kind of centers. So that's my background. But I want to find out who you are. How many of you are outreach workers? Okay. So can you tell me who are some of the other youth work people here and what you do specifically? Anybody? What's that? Case manager? Yes, sir. Violence intervention coordinator for Hennepin County Medical Center. Is that right? Okay. Who else? I see Brittany Place people. You want to say what you do? No, you don't want to do that. Youth workers and case managers for Brittany's Place. Anyone else? Social workers? Residential care folks? Yeah, some? Other? Okay. Anybody we missed? All right. Well, again, I had the pleasure of spending some time with those of you that are outreach workers, and I've never done youth outreach, so I want to say that straight up, just so you know that. I have deep, deep admiration and respect for those of you that do that work and the way in which you do it. So I just want to make sure you know I haven't done that. So I'll count on your expertise. As we start this training on trauma-informed care, I want to remind us that as human beings, as caring, passionate about youth, committed to the work that we do kind of human beings, that we are going to make mistakes, right? That's not our intention. We come at our work with great heart and care, and we understand that the youth that we work with have been through so much. So we're dealing with people who have great big gaping wounds and a whole bunch of little ones and everything in between. So I just want to say that when we approach our work with wanting to do it well and to care about what's happening with the youth and paying attention to what the youth can tell us in their behavior, their attitude, what they do say, what they don't say, even if we make mistakes, it's going to be okay. All right? We need to count on each other and find out, well, what did I do? How did I screw that up? Oh my God, I just had this interaction with this kid and I know I hurt his or her or their feelings, right? Talking to your colleagues, talking to the youth themselves, and being able to say, I think I just messed up. Tell me what I did and what I should do better. All of that communicates to the youth that you work with that you care deeply and that you're willing to learn. So I just want to start off saying that. Is there anybody here that hasn't made a mistake with a youth that they've worked with? Anybody in this room? Jim? You?
Well, yeah.
All right, so that's where we begin. I want to mention that you have this lengthy resource list. In my role as the Safe Harbor Training Coordinator with Minnesota Department of Health, and you've had Lauren Ryan come and talk about the Safe Harbor of Minnesota. She's our statewide director. So a lot of this has a lot of information, resources, tools, etc. related to working with sexually exploited kids. But it also has, I think starting on page 9, a whole bunch of resources on trauma, trauma-informed care, research or issues related to youth that are in the juvenile justice system or child welfare system. So I wanted to make note of that. All right, and so we begin. The learning objectives. Understand basic adolescent brain development, physiology, and the impact of trauma on the brain development. How many of you have had that kind of training before? Okay, a number of you. So this will be a reminder. Participants will be able to recognize the signs of trauma and be able to make a good decision about referral services needed. How many of you feel like you have a good sense of what are the signs of trauma exposure? A lot of you? Okay, good. Participants will identify policies and practices that could be improved within your own organizations, your own work, etc. Things that, you know, as you think about this thing called trauma-informed care, what are some things that you do in your work or you're expected to do in your work that kind of make you go, I don't know if that's a good way to approach this, right? So we're going to spend some time figuring that out. All right. My goals for you are that you see, hear, and process this information first and foremost through the eyes of the youth that you work with and through a trauma-informed lens. So to process it through the eyes of the youth that you work with. Actually, I'm asking you to kind of process it on multiple levels. Like, so how many of you were youth at one point in your life? All of you, right? So I know that in this room we have people who have had similar experiences to the very children and youth that you work with now, right? So you're going to be thinking about that. And then how many of you are parents? All right, so you're going to be thinking about, you know, your own children, their experiences. Even if you're not a parent, I know there are children and youth in your lives that you love dearly. They might be nieces, nephews, neighbors, kids that you coach or what have you. So you're going to be thinking about youth in general related to this information. I want to validate and reinforce all the good things you know and do. So for many of you, the things that I'm going to present are just reminders, right? You already know this stuff. There's a lot of you in this room that come to this work with a great deal of instinct on what's the best way to approach a youth or what doesn't make sense to approach a youth. And then there are many of us in the room that have to develop that understanding, the skills to do the work, right? So it's a variety, but either way, you know a lot. So I want you to feel really good about the things that you're doing through this thing called trauma-informed care. And then I want to provide you with a lot more information that might enhance and improve what you already know and what you already do. So Jim asked me specifically to talk about the adolescent brain. How many of you have had, a lot of you raised your hand saying that you have had that information, right? So generally speaking, and the research sort of shifts on this, but the adolescent brain, if all things are normal, quote unquote, meaning the child, the baby, the infant, the toddler, etc., has received everything he or she or they need in life in order to develop. So when is the brain, adolescent brain, finished developing? 25, I heard 28. 26, so I recently heard that female children finish developing at 25, male children at 26. The many Native American cultures have understood this thing of adolescence, that it goes well into the 20s they just knew that, right? They didn't have a scientist or research telling them that. But generally speaking, if a baby, a child, a youth is provided with everything he or she or they need, in their life, nurturance, care, safety, food, shelter, all of those kind of things, the brain will finish developing at 25. So around 25. When you think about the youth that you serve, how many of those youth have been provided with everything they need? Yeah, many of you are going like this. Like, do you work with youth that have gotten everything that they've needed in terms of love, nurturance, care, safety, food, shelter, all of that other kind of stuff? Okay. So what happens to the brain? We're going to talk about that in a second. But I love this image because here's another teenage brain image. We have Facebook lobe, formerly known as MySpace. Is there anybody here that's old enough to remember MySpace? Okay. All right. We have the twilight lobe, mutated from the Harry Potter lobe. Digital download. We had lobe. Spinal cord part that just wants to fit in. The Red Bull repository. And then old people are clueless lobe, or whatever youth want to call it. And then the texting lobe, right? So that's another image. If we go back, what's the last part of the brain to develop? The prefrontal cortex, or the texting lobe. That's right here, right? And what does this part of the brain, what is that part of the brain's function? Long-term consequences, decision-making, impulse control, personality, Yeah, a little bit. Decision making. It's really the executive. It's the executive, the CEO of the brain, if you will. Sort of it really puts it all together. It's all that logic, reasoning kind of thing. That's the last to develop. So when you think about kids, youth, children, who have experienced lots of trauma exposure, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, maltreatment, or neglect, those kind of things. Does the brain still develop in the same way and along the same development lines? No, right? So things get awry. The developmental process does not happen as it should. So the youth that you are working with have a lot going on, right? They have a lot going on outside of their cells, but certainly inside of their brain and what else happens inside their body. So trauma terms, just really quickly, and you see a lot of different definitions. I'm just putting these up. Trauma, experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. I want us to remember that it can be a single event. One trauma exposure can derail a human being, right? Multiple events or a set of circumstances that is physically and emotionally harmful or threatening can have long-lasting effects on the person who experienced it. Childhood traumatic stress. Children who suffer from child traumatic stress are those youth and children who have been exposed to one or more traumas over the course of their lives, and they develop reactions that persist and affect their daily lives after the traumatic events. This is not an all-inclusive list, but I want you to think about the youth that you work with. Maybe think about one particular youth that was the most challenging you've ever worked with, or the most wounded, or the most troubled child that you ever worked with. If you can think of him or her or them, and kind of look at that list. If you had that youth here, that child here, how many of these could they check off? Right? Almost all, for the person that you're thinking about, almost all of them, yeah. When you think about what happens, the trauma exposure that they experience, sometimes on a daily basis, and especially when we're talking about street youth who are out in the street, sexually exploited, sex trafficked kids, it's a daily, sometimes hour by hour trauma exposure. That's a lot. When I think about the kids I've worked with through the years, and I've known some of their story, some of these things, it's amazing to me that they're alive, right? It's amazing to me that they're alive. Our youth that we work with are incredibly resilient, right? So even though we can get overwhelmed with sadness about the terrible things that have happened to them, if they're in front of you, even for a minute, they have survived. And we'll talk more about that. Yes, sir.
My quick question is, pretty much, what happens when these youths become adults? At what age do you stop supporting them? Because if they're not developed by 25, some of them end up growing to be 40 years old with that same mentality.
Right.
So is there any services for them? Because now that these children believe that they're adults, they believe that their ways are correct, and then they kind of teach it to their children.
Right.
So is there like any kind of services that helps these kind of children as they grow out of that age group?
Sure, that's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is that it is never too late to get help. It's never too late to get support and education and counseling around trauma. So you're really talking about that intergenerational trauma exposure and the transmission of risk from one generation to another, right? So in terms of, it's a big question that you ask. What we really want to do is have a lot more services out there, people-friendly services, culturally relevant services, so that wherever anybody is at on their journey of recognizing that, oh my God, I've been really traumatized and it's affecting my life, that they would have easy, affordable access to people who would understand it and could help them. So I was really pleased that Governor Dayton put a whole lot of money into the budget for mental health services. We'll see how that plays out and if they will be fairly and equitably divided up around the state, and if they will be divided up based on cultural responsivity needs too. So,
Paula,
Yes,
could I
sir.
throw something in
Yes,
there?
please.
I think one of the things that this kind of stresses is that sometimes we look in terms of our partnerships, we look primarily with like youth services, trying to make sure that youth services stretch up to 24 or even beyond and things like that. I think it's IFRA, right? Fart. Sorry. I think you bring up a really good point that our partnerships with quote unquote adult services are really important, sometimes because of what we can take away from those services, but also what we can possibly give to those services. Some of the best practices that we've developed in the youth world really are best practices for the adult world. And I think the more partnerships we have with those, again, quote unquote adult services, can be really helpful for our clients long term. The client that we have who's 22 right now or who's 18 right now will eventually be served by HCMC, an adult service. And if we're not partnering with HCMC to help them understand kind of like what those best practices are, when our 18 or 22-year-old client turns 27, if HCMC is better at dealing with some of the stuff that we use, if they've adopted some of our best practices, that youth that we're working with now will be better served by those services later.
Right. Very well said. I do want to mention too that it went into effect July 1st of this year, but any safe harbor services are now it was up until the age of 18, but it's now for, in addition to youth under age 18, it's 18 to 24 for housing and services. Yeah, that is nice. It doesn't decriminalize if 18 to 24-year-olds are, hopefully people aren't arresting them, but we know that's true. It doesn't decriminalize their involvement in sex trafficking or sex or being sold for sex or selling themselves for sex. So it's a good question. All right, through our eyes. So I have, this is about a 13-minute video. Some of you have already seen it, but I think it does a really good job of providing a high-level overview of trauma and the impact of trauma on youth. So what I want you to think about is, like, do you, in terms of your own work and the youth that you've worked with, are you kind of connecting to what you're hearing or seeing in the video? And then maybe afterward, I'll ask you if anything surprised you. It's a hard video to watch, so I want to warn you about that.
My mother and my brother were murdered in front of me. He put the gun to my head, and he had me beg for my life. I was 10. I just turned 10.
It's hard to come out and say that I was a victim and that I was abused, especially when you're little, because it's like a big secret that's always on your back and that you never know when it's going to come out.
The image of my brother falling on that concrete floor and people stepping and just kicking with shoes on his face, I couldn't get that image out of my head.
Trauma is an overwhelming event. It takes away our safety, it creates a sense of helplessness, and it continues to affect our perception of our reality.
Some of the telltale signs of trauma are quite evident. Many of these symptoms, it's not that we don't see them, it's that we don't put together the entire sort of picture of what trauma is. Inability to sleep or interrupted sleep, inability to focus on what's going on, really not able to attend to learning. Adults need to be aware of children who are exposed to violence and intervene early and stop it.
I don't like the environment that I stay in. People getting killed every day, drug deals, people getting snatched, raped, cut up.
Whether it is a child who witnesses violence or a child who is the victim, you can't be fearful and be able to live your normal life. You have to be able to think clearly, and when you're traumatized, you can't do that.
Violence continues then to affect a child in their perception of their community, of their family. The danger is right around the corner. and the brain gets wired to expect danger.
My dad started actually physically beating me to the point to where I'd go to school covered in bruises. I don't know how many times I've been threatened to be killed by my own dad.
My brother got shot in the head. He ain't make it.
It makes you afraid at times. It makes you feel that, oh my God, you know what, I just lost a friend, I just lost a family member. It just makes you feel that, hey, I could die next, I could be the next one dead.
What trauma does is it triggers what's called the amygdala in the brain, which is our fight, flight, freeze center.
And it truly is a change in the brain and a change in the stress hormones that are flowing through the body.
All our brains have what we call alarm systems. Because the brain now has been wired for danger and it's triggered into this fight-flight, we don't just get over a traumatic event. It continues to impact us.
I started hearing my mom scream in the middle of the night. And it got to the point where he started beating me and my sisters. I let my anger build up, didn't talk to anybody about it.
When you hold everything aside, it's like a bomb and it's like you're ready to explode and just somebody push that last button.
Most kids who've experienced violence oftentimes have experienced multiple types of violence. In the kids we see, the average number of different types of violent trauma is 4. And so complex trauma then affects multiple areas of the brain because it's ongoing.
Maybe it's gang warfare, maybe it's drug use and abuse in the family, maybe it's domestic violence, maybe it's bullying at school. And if there is a layering effect of cumulative violence, it changes literally the DNA.
It all started off with the hugging game. He would take us into his room. We would sit on his lap and he would hug us, and we weren't supposed to tell anyone.
When I was 5, I would have to leave kindergarten class and go home and have sex with this man who was in his 50s. I remember the long walk home and crying and falling down and having to get back up and walking on.
Child sexual abuse exists in the neighborhood, exists unfortunately at our schools, at our churches, at our homes, everywhere. And there are children out there suffering.
My first assault was in high school. I met a guy at the church and he wanted to be my friend. I thought it'd be great. And instead he assaulted me and I felt very scared.
When you have a child that doesn't get to work through that abuse in the appropriate manner, that abuse doesn't go away. It lives in that child.
Exposure to violence in childhood has been found to be associated with a really unbelievable range of long-term impacts.
Very young children who are exposed to violence many times have difficulty in establishing a trusting relationship. These children have fears.
You're twice as likely to develop depression. You're probably 3 times as likely to develop some type of anxiety disorder.
As they move into school age, they may have very, very serious behavior problems. As we look at adolescence, we see children running away. Sometimes children may be involved in the juvenile justice system, which puts the child at risk for being an adult offender. And so the cost of violence is staggering.
I felt isolated. Nobody knew what I was going through. To go 3 years without talking about it, I imploded.
Finally, after stressing and keeping everything bottled up and everything building up, I just finally broke down one day and attempted suicide.
Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death of children and adolescents in this country. We always ask in every case, what role might child abuse have played?
My mother, she knew that stuff was going on, but it just seemed like she didn't really care. She never stopped that abuse. And to this day, I've never forgotten what some of my family members have done to me.
These are traumatized kids. And so how do we then, as adults, professionals, caregivers, put a system around children that really is trauma-informed?
Happy feeling. Good job. Okay? So I want
What do we do differently to help rewire their brain? And then ultimately, how do we build capacity in order to really help our kids?
Everybody come together, whether it's in the community, in the home, in the school, wherever children are, and child by child, think of ways in which we can intervene early and educate people about what children need in order to grow, to thrive, and to continue to be resilient human beings.
So, any reactions? A lot of the stories that you saw in here are similar to the stories your kids that you work with have, yeah? Anything surprise you? Okay, it's kind of a heavy video because it's real live people talking about their stories. It's a good education video, and you can access it by going to the website. They have a whole bunch of different short videos about trauma in the how the juvenile justice system needs to address it. I think they're always doing new ones, so they might have one for the mental health provider network. So I think it does a really good job of doing high level. I also think that the more our youth understand these things, like in the information you saw in the film, the psychologist was teaching the young girl about what happens in the brain, right? Think about the power that if they had that information, what that might mean to them. Instead of beating themselves up about, I'm this or I'm that. No, I understand that this is common stuff that happens to people who have had these types of trauma exposures. So I want to mention that. So when you work with the youth that you do, whether it's in placement or out on the street, what you see before you is just a small piece of what actually can have already happened for that youth or what is happening inside him or her or them, right? So it's that tip of the iceberg. And especially for sexually exploited, sex trafficked kids, there's so much there, right? There's just so much there that we don't know about. Some of you might know because of your experience. You can recognize, oh, I think this is what's happening to this youth, but you can't really get at it because he or she or them might not be able to tell you. But just understand that when you're working with traumatized kids, that you only see a little bit of it. So I want to move into culture, right? So I'm just going to give you a definition, real simple definition. Culture, the beliefs, customs, values, ways of thinking, behaving, shared goals, etc. of a particular group, society, organization, place, or time. And now I'm going to throw up this term, culture of survival. Culture of survival. What does that mean? Anyone? Culture of survival. Man, he just shoved that in your face, didn't he?
I'd say ways and behaviors, yeah. To get through just difficult everyday life experiences, and that maybe there's, certain behaviors that are acceptable and work in a culture of survival that maybe a mainstream culture we see and go, whoa, what, what's going on there? That's
well
how I
said.
see it.
That's very well said. So I don't need to add more to what you're saying other than for us to understand that for exactly what you said, it's about adaptation. Every living organism on this planet has the ability to adapt to its environment and surroundings in order to live, right? So that's what we're talking about. We may not understand why they do what they do, and some of the things you've seen youth do, you're like, really? Or if you're a new worker, right? Or especially in juvenile justice, right? Your first day on the floor, if you're in a custody-based setting, and kids start throwing out their trauma-related behaviors, and people are like floored. Like, why do they act like that, right? It's about this. It's about changing to suit the environment, the development of physical and behavioral characteristics that allow organisms to survive. And what you just said, doing whatever it is that you have to do in order to get through the minute, the hour, the day, the month, right? Culture of survival. Your youth that you work with, especially the youth that you work with that are out on the streets, they are masters at culture of survival, right? Learn behaviors. I want to introduce another thought for you, this notion of hidden resilience. It's very much connected to culture of survival. So for people who don't understand the experiences of youth, the youth that you work with, and they think it's really bizarre, and they think these kids are just doing it, like, or what are some of the diagnoses we give kids that end up in child welfare, juvenile justice? Tell me the top ones that you hear. What was it? ADHD. What's another one? That adjustment disorder. I wish they would say that one more frequently. Adjustment disorder. What other ones? In juvenile justice, what do they say? ODD. What is that? Yes, oppositional defiant disorder. And the other one that's right along there with that, OCD, well, that one sort of. Conduct disorder, right? Conduct disorder and opposition defiant disorder. Anybody in this room besides me would gladly claim those two disorders at some point in your... Somebody else raise your hand. Thank you very much. Thank you, right? None of that, none of those DSM 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, very few, actually connect to what's really happening in a child's life or speak to trauma exposure. So I want to introduce this notion of hidden resilience. Michael Unger is a professor up in British Columbia at BC University, and they have a whole department on resiliency. I think the University of Minnesota does here as well. But so I just want to do a shout out to them. That this is from him, is when a person doesn't conform to or with society's expectation for how they are supposed to behave. In some contexts, aggression may be required to cope, or less emotional engagement may be protective in situations of abuse. You see that every day, don't you? Every single day, right? But when we're confronted with kids, I think most of the youth that are acting out really aggressive or, really resistant, it's hard for us to think of this nice little concept of hidden resilience, right? We might be much more judgmental, or in our head, we might be labeling them different names that you wouldn't necessarily say out loud, right? Yeah, just think about your most challenging child that I asked you to think about, and sort of maybe thinking about the hidden resilience in that person's trauma response behavior or culture of survival behavior, because they're sort of one and the same. So thanks for the example. All right, so when we think about culture of survival behavior, we judge youth's behavior, I think, pretty negatively in child welfare and juvenile justice. That's my experience. It might not be yours, right? And I think sometimes new people to this work can become quickly judgmental if they don't have good mentors or people who are going to train them in and get this notion of culture of survival. One way to help people understand that they're not doing this to you personally, it ain't about us, right? So one way to think about it is that culture of survival behavior is born out of trauma. The youth you work with, and this child, I don't need to know her, but I'm sure she has really healthy, safe and legal coping skills as well, right? Is there one thing that she does well in terms of coping with her trauma? Art. There you go. All right? That's healthy, that's safe, that's legal. Then we have things like unhealthy, unsafe, cutters, kids who cut themselves. It's direct. For most of youth or even adults who cut themselves, there is some trauma exposure that it's related to, right? We don't like it, and it scares us, so we put it in this pile or this box. But for survivors, isn't it also over here? Why? And even over here? Why am I saying that? It could be placed in any of those. Go ahead.
Because, maybe
I love
You're so
watching
quick.
Jim have to run
Yeah.
around. So if you could do bing, bing, bing. Okay.
Because maybe for that youth, it is a harm reduction way of I'm not I'm not killing myself. I'm not hurting someone else. I'm
Right.
just, letting go a little of that steam or that blood or whatever.
Harm reduction, you heard that term. We're going to talk about that. That's it exactly. So I've heard survivors say, I'm not trying to kill myself, because in the juvenile justice world, we get real, oh my God, it's a suicide attempt, right? And I'm not trying to downplay that, because you have to be really careful. But I've heard survivors say, no, this helps me so I don't try to kill myself, right? So again, it doesn't necessarily make sense to us, but it certainly does to that survivor, and it's harm reduction. So very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. So just thinking about the culture of survival behaviors and how we can see this notion of hidden resilience. So instead of putting everything in this box, it's not that clear and cut, is it? All right. Okay, so now we're going to stay on culture, and we're going to talk about the culture of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, because remember, shared goals, ways of thinking, ways of being, that defines any culture for a specific group, let's say. So when you think about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, what's the main overall goal? Let's start with that. Money for who? For all of us? For who? So the overall goal is to get money for the exploiter, right? That's the number one goal. Is that correct? Yeah. That's why they do it. Okay? So then everything else that happens within that culture supports that main goal. The values, the rules. Aren't there a lot of rules in sexual exploitation, sex trafficking for youth that they have to know? Right? Give me a rule. What's one of the rules?
Do what the exploiter says.
Do what the exploiter says. Yep. What's another rule? Make your quota, right? What happens if you don't make your quota? Violence. You're punished, because the overall goal is to make the quota, make the exploiter rich, right? So there's all sorts of values and rules around that. How does the exploiter, one you already mentioned, violence, how else does the exploiter, he or she or them, make sure that everybody follows the rules and the values of the culture? What tactics do they employ?
Isolation.
Isolation? Yep. Take away your basic needs. Threaten family and everybody else, right? Animals, yep. What else do they do? So threaten, isolation, take away, they don't help you meet your basic needs. Rape, yep.
This is my boyfriend, this is my daddy, this is the person who loves me.
Yeah. And I do love you. That's why I have to beat you when you don't make your quota. You have to listen to me. I have your best interest in mind. You know that, don't you? What is that called? Manipulation, right? Propaganda, manipulation, using my relationship, understanding that I have worked really hard to make sure you think that I am the most important person in your life, right? And I'm going to use that time and time again, because the overall goal is to make sure I get money, right? So we got that part, right? There's a lot more we could say about the culture and the rules and values, and you all probably know it way better than me. But what I want to lead to is this trauma bonding. So that's that issue of, I would work very hard to convince Jim that I am the only person in this world that loves him and cares about him and is worried about his best interest. His family doesn't care about him, right? So it's otherwise known as Stockholm Syndrome, right? So that brainwashing thing that happens. In time, like a baby, the victim feels dependent upon the exploiter for all of their emotional and physical needs. The person forms a powerful emotional attachment to the exploiter, which he or she doggedly reinforces through a pattern of abuse, violence, and love and reward. Okay? So why am I bringing this up as it relates to trauma-informed care? What does this mean to you in your work? It's how the youth see their world. Okay?
I mean, they learn that that's their world. So
Yeah.
That's how they see it, and we need to understand that.
Yeah, why? Why is that important? So now I'm a counselor, that Jim is in a he's coming to a community program, and I'm a counselor. I'm no longer his exploiter, right? Okay, Jim, so we have gone over this same thing at least 10 times, right? You know I care about you, don't you? All right, I really need you to listen to me and do as I say. Actually, I have a PhD, and I'm really smart, and I'm an adult. And you're not so smart, and you're a kid. I might not say it like that, right? But what am I doing to him? What tactic am I using? Manipulation. I'm using my relationship. Or, on the other hand, Jim, if you continue down this path, do you know what terrible, awful things are going to happen to you? Well, let me tell you. Oh, my God. One more night on the street and blah, 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 blah. What's that tactic? Scare tactic.
Tough love.
Tough love. Tough love, right? And I really am doing it because I know what's best for him. And it's really in his best interest. So it's okay if I manipulate, isn't it? Or use scare tactics. Or say, Jim, I am no longer going to see you anymore if you don't do as I say. What's that? Begins with a T. It's a threat. Are any of those tactics, they're the same. Is it okay for me to do it because I know what's in his best interest?
Not if you actually want to help them.
Very good. Okay. So.
Can I jump in too?
Yes, please.
I think you've illustrated a really good point that a lot of the tactics that will be really critical about the perpetrators, about that kind of manipulation, threats, that kind of thing. We see that done. We often do it ourselves, but we have different names for it that sounds a lot better. Manipulation is just keeping it real, just being really real with them and trying to, build a relationship with them. I want them to know I have their best interests at heart, even when they disagree with me. Threats, when we do it, when it's a threat, when a pimp does it, when we do it, it is natural consequences, I think, is one of my favorite things. But it's still a threat, and we try to sit there and say, it's not really a threat, it's natural consequences. And we have to say that because it's actually still a threat. And, and you and I have talked about this as part of this training. We need to have ongoing discussions about boundaries in our work. And I don't just mean one training. I don't just mean like making sure that at least once every once in a while we talk about it in a team meeting. At Streetworks, outreach workers, we need to make this a basic part of how we approach the work. We need to be talking about this often with each other and with our supervisors and with our clients, because those boundaries are so important. We can sometimes use our best intentions as an excuse to break those boundaries. And this is what's happening, okay? Is that basically we're just using best intentions as an excuse to use the same tactics that the perpetrators are using.
Yeah. And I want to underscore, we don't do it intentionally. Like, we aren't doing it to be mean-spirited or to, like, we're not thinking, I think I'm going to go exploit a couple of kids today, right? It's not what we're thinking, right? But the reason why Jim asked me to address this is that it's subtle, right? It can creep up on us, and we might not even be aware of it. But who is aware of it? The kids. Yeah, they can recognize it very quickly. And what does that do then to your goal of connecting to them? It undermines it, right? And so you don't want to do that. So we just wanted to make sure we talked about that from a trauma-informed standpoint. The youth that you work with, the traumatized, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to just to make that clear.
Yeah.
The tough love, the manipulation, the scare tactic, these are things that we refrain from using with the children.
Yeah. What should you do instead?
My concern would be the scare tactic. A lot of the children don't understand the consequences of their actions. So sometimes I kind of let them know. I've only had like 2 juveniles, and using those tactics doesn't necessarily help them in the end.
Yeah.
'Cause
Right.
I'm kind of confused because the guys that I saw, and I let them know, man, you keep doing this, you're going to end up jamming yourself. You got one shot at life.
Yeah.
These are the things that I'm explaining to them.
Yeah.
And they seem to be receptive of it. I could be messing something up in there.
I think it's the approach, don't you? It's kind of like saying, here are the things that I'm concerned about that could possibly happen, or I feel strongly will happen if you continue on. Don't make any conditions to it. Like, I'm not going to continue to help you if you do it because these bad things are going to happen, and then I'll feel bad because it really is all about me, right? So it's more of how you approach it. I think, giving youth honest and real information, it's the way in which we do that and how we might try to sway them one way or the other. And we're going to get into that whole thing about more on harm reduction. It's really about, give them the information. They have to decide what to do with it. They don't need us to keep pounding it into them or trying to manipulate them. Does that make sense? Or does somebody else have something else they want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say it definitely has a lot to do with the approach, but more so it really depends on what your relationship is with that young person.
There you go.
If it's somebody that you've worked with for some time and you're comfortable having that conversation, being real is you appreciate, someone being genuine. That's how always been my approach. But if I don't know you well, and I don't have that relationship, I definitely approach it. I'll probably give the same information, but the way that I say it, the way I approach it will look completely different.
Yeah. Well said. And you had.
And I think, too, with that, I think some youth, depending on what kind of trauma they've been through, they might just hear those words and they might just totally turn off because of their trauma, because they've heard them before. And you might not know that they've disconnected emotionally from the situation.
Good point. Good point.
One other tool that I've used, particularly with staff that are thinking about using the scare tactic or have used the scare tactic, want to talk about how effective it is. Keep in mind about why it's so effective, okay? That scare tactic that you're using. These youth that we're working with have seen stuff that will change the color of your hair just by hearing the story. If you think you're being scary, either A, you're actually scaring the youth, in which case you're tapping into some really dangerous stuff. It'll feel effective because it'll get results, okay? But it doesn't get results because you're doing something right. It's getting results because you're tapping into some of the scariest stuff they've ever experienced, okay? So when you're using scare tactics and it's working, think about why it's working, and that should probably tell you why you shouldn't be using it. The other thing, too, is that keep in mind that when scare tactics doesn't work, it's because you're competing with the scariest stuff they've ever experienced, So either A, it's effective and you tap into it, or B, you attempt to tap into it and that youth is going to look at you going, you really think you're that scary? You haven't seen what I've seen. Either one is not an effective tactic, not if you're trying to help the youth. You can only, if you're using a scare tactic, you can only go one of two ways, and neither one of them is good.
Good. Well said. Is this helpful? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for asking that question. I'm going to buzz through some things quickly, just in an effort of time. You heard on the video about the response that happens in youth. I want to add just a couple things. You heard the gentleman talk about fight or flight. So these are biochemical reactions. They're not something that we consciously, I think I'm going to go into flight right now. Or maybe I'll do freeze. Maybe I'll do fight. I mean, maybe we do, maybe I will try to fight my way out of something. But again, the point about the neurobiological science that we now have that we didn't have years ago is really important for us to understand that these things are real and they happen very quickly and they can cause a lot of pain and anxiety for youth. So I want to go to triggers with that. Any of you ever felt that way, deer in a headlight? Yeah. Okay. That's adrenaline, right? That's a biochemical response. So I want to go to triggers because Jim asked me to talk about that. You've all heard of triggers, right? And if you haven't, I'll just do a reminder about that. It can be a person, place, or thing, something that suddenly causes a survivor to re-experience a past trauma and the intense feelings they had during that traumatic event or events, in the case of many of the youth you work with. It can happen instantly, it's unconscious, and it can be very disturbing to you. So how many of you have actually seen a youth when they just got triggered? Most of you have, and some of you have and you just necessarily didn't know it. I put the light switch there because it can happen that quickly, like flipping a switch. So what can trigger trauma response behavior and or PTSD symptoms? Again, this is not an all-inclusive list. You probably could create the list. Those of you that work with youth that are out on the street, you could probably create a very lengthy list of things that trigger youth. But these things are real. Again, so if you don't understand trauma-informed care, if you don't understand this work that you all do, it's like, she was fine. My God, we were laughing and joking, and then all of a sudden, blah, you know? She got triggered, or he got triggered. But those are just some of the examples. You get triggered too, right? As staff, as helpers, as outreach workers. So one of the things Michelle did during the film was hand me a note about, can you talk about secondary trauma for you all, right? So Jim didn't want me to take the time in this hour and a half, because it goes by really quickly. Not because he didn't think it was important, but because you're planning on doing one at another point.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You actually wanted to do the self-care and the vicarious trauma stuff. 2 months ago at our OW meeting after our last training, one of the things that the outreach workers asked for was a good self-care training. And we realized that vicarious trauma is going to be part of that self-care stuff. So knowing that we were going to have limited time, I basically asked that we kind of like hold that for that future training, devote an entire training to that, and focus on the youth part of this trauma. So thank you.
Because you certainly deserve that, but we wanted to make sure that everybody understands that you get triggered too. So I was going to do some more of the science, so I just want to do this really quickly. Our autonomic nervous system is made up of the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, right? So when you heard the things happening in the film, or when somebody gets triggered, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's stimulated at that point, right? So mobilizes the body for action, fight or flight. These things happen, faster heart rate, faster breathing, and breathing up high rather than fully in the lungs. The other organs kind of shut down the work they're doing because they're preparing the body for fight or flight, so like digestion stops, etc. These kind of things. Adrenaline is secreted by the adrenal glands, all right? It's not bad that this happens to us sometimes. What's not good or healthy for us is that if we stay in this all the time. And going back to the tip of the iceberg, like your kids, I would say many of them are in a constant state of survival. They are actually sort of in a constant state of having their sympathetic nervous system being stimulated, right? That has long-term health consequences for all of us, any of us. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest. That's where we feel pretty good. We have slower heart rates. Our heart is allowed to do its work in a slower way, in a more full way. We're able to take deep breaths. Our other organs are doing what they're supposed to do, right? Lower blood pressure, all of that. So when you have the self-care, you're going to have somebody who's going to come in and talk about mindfulness and helping you all learn how to move from this being stimulated to this. And you want that for your youth too. You can't take them home. I know you want to. I know you want to take them home and protect them and keep them safe, right? But you can't. So especially for you outreach workers, you have this much time in a week that you get to see a particular kid. Maybe you see them every day, but you don't get a whole lot of time to really comfort them, take care of them, that kind of thing. So the importance of this is that we want to teach youth how to manage the triggers and the fallout from the trauma so that they're not constantly in this state. Because when any of us are in this state, our body's preparing for the fight or flight, it takes the blood flow from the thinking part of our brain, okay, the prefrontal cortex. We don't make good decisions when we're super stressed, overwhelmed, right, or in that survival state. Because all we can think about is, how do I get out of here? How do I defend myself? Right? Is all the bad stuff that's happened to me before going to happen again? We're not thinking about, what strategies should I employ to address this situation, right? We're not, because we're not in this state. We can't do it. So what I want to talk about really quickly is this notion, the trauma and the impact on memory. So trauma has impact on physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Trauma can drastically impact a person's memory. For many of the youth that you work with that are out on the street, one of their coping, I would say, culture of survival skills is chemical use, isn't it? Self-medication. So you add that to already being like sort of in a state of survival. And how do you think that works in terms of your cognitive functioning or your ability to remember things? Reduces it, right? That's just a physical thing. Although I do want to say that there are some youth that chemical use, and I'm not advocating for it, but I'm understanding it. Chemical use can help them get out of the sympathetic nervous system stimulation into parasympathetic, stimulate the parasympathetic so they're calmer and they are able to think. So those kids that say, I just need a little weed right now, thank you, right? Or whatever they call it. They still calling it weed? You know, I'm so old, I don't know what that thing is. So in my day, it was Mary Jane. Yeah, that is funny, isn't it? That is really funny. Okay, so what does this mean to you? If you have a youth who's in a survival state, might be using chemicals to, manage, and they don't remember stuff. So what I'm wanting you to think about is I want you to think about this, because if you're a fast talker like me, you might have 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes with you, so I just need to give you all this information. Here's a brochure. Oh, here's another brochure. Oh, and here's a card. And here, so I want you to go see this nice person over here that really can help you. She's a great counselor, blah, 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 blah. 5 minutes later, what did you retain if you're that kid? Yeah. Yeah, you smiled and you nodded, right? But inside you're like, what the hell is she talking? Why is she talking? Any of that kind of stuff. So just thinking about how you approach a child that you don't know. On the outside, they might be going, yeah, right, okay, got it. On the inside, there was a Far Side cartoon was, this is what you say to your dog. This is what your dog hears. Blah, 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 right? So you want to adapt your behavior. Slow things down. Give little bits of information. Decide what is the most important bit of information you want this child to have right now. And if indeed they're having difficulty with their memory or processing it, how can you give it in a reasonable chunk of information that they're going to be able to retain? If it's just a phone, like you want them to go see somebody that can help them with ... just give them the phone number then, or whatever it is, or maybe a card. Do you know what I'm saying with that? Change your behavior to meet the needs of that child. And again, you can't assume that when they go, yeah, I got it, I'll write it down. Yeah, I'll go. That they really can even understand what you're saying. First aid for hyperarousal and survival response. So this is cheap. This is like the cheapest thing. And you don't have to have even a high school education to be able to offer this first aid or a medical degree or anything like that. What am I going to say? So a person's really in that survival state, trauma response, the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. What is that? Breathing, right? Cheapest first aid you can do. This is for yourselves as well, all right? And this is why this is incredibly important. So the physiology of breathing. Breathing is controlled by both the autonomic nervous system, unconscious, automatic. How many of you were thinking consciously about your breathing throughout this whole presentation? None of you, right? From the moment you were born and took your first breath, your body did it automatically, thankfully, or we wouldn't be here, right? So the voluntary nervous system is the other part of that. Conscious, it's the conscious part of breathing. We can actively intervene at this level. To be in that hyper arousal survival state is really provides a lot of anxiety, right? Anguish even. If you're constantly, and when you think about the youth that you work with, the amount of fear that they carry around with them, right? What's going to happen to me next? And reliving all the bad, terrible things that have happened to them, or they're actively being exploited by somebody who's really hurting them. So we want them to be able to manage that fallout, whether they're with you or not. So you want to teach them just how to breathe. Okay, so what I want you to do right now, put your feet flat on the floor, about hip width away. Sit up straight in your chair, right? Anybody do yoga in here? Okay, if you do yoga, your instructors told you the breath is the most important thing, even more important than the poses, right? So you're going to sit up straight. You're going to put your hands on your thighs, just in a relaxed state. Okay, a lot of people are yawning, so you desperately need this deep breathing, right? Okay, and what you're going to do is you're going to put your hands on your belly. We're going to do diaphragmatic belly breathing. Okay, so you're going to put your hands on your belly just gently, and then when you breathe in through your nose, if you have allergies or something, breathe in through your mouth. But you're going to breathe in deeply and slowly, and you're going to pretend like this is a balloon right here, not up here. There's a big balloon here, and you're going to fill that balloon so to the point that your hands actually expand. So we're going to take a exhale slowly, inhale slowly, exhale slowly. Two more times. Okay, how do you feel? Did you notice anything different? Anybody? What changed? Huh? You ready to take a nap? Be my guest. Just move the chair over. What else? Anybody else notice anything? You relaxed? How did you know that? Your mind rested. What happened, Jen? Your shoulders dropped. Instead of being like, if you're like me, your stress is in your shoulders and your neck, right? And when we're really stressed out or scared or something, we kind of tighten up, don't we? Right? So this thing, this first aid, this breathing thing, can activate the relaxation response. It puts a brake on that hyperarousal state. It releases the happy hormones, which is what we want to do. And our right hemisphere is influenced, opening up our receptivity. So it is not a stretch, especially if you know the kid, but even if you don't, if they're in that really like stressed out state, to calmly ask them if you can help them with the little first aid. Like, is it Hans? Yep. Hans, I can see you're really stressed out. Would it be all right if I just kind of help you calm down a little bit? Would that be okay? All right, so what we're going to do together is we're going to do breathing, just nice and slow and easy, to model it for them if they're willing to do that. Now, if they're not, that's fine. That's their choice, right? But you want them to be able to do that, because if you want to assist them, that's the first thing I would assist them with, is to just calm down, because it's no fun to be in that state. It really sucks, doesn't it, to be in that angry or hurt or afraid state? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also say just to make sure that we're doing it with ourselves, even if it's not a place to invite the youth to do it with us, because I can't remember what part of the brain, but that there's a part of us that syncs our breathing with the other person that we're face to face with. So even if you don't feel comfortable asking them to do a breathing exercise, just being that example of deep breathing will help them tap into it.
Good point. Very good point. That's called mirroring. So thank you for that. And yep, if you're calm, if your voice goes down and slow, very good. That's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so this is a video you had. So I need to say that this all will be on the website, correct? So you can go to this. This is a fun way to teach if you have your phone with you all the time. If a kid is interested in learning a little bit more about this breathing thing, this is a fun video to do it. It's kids and adults learning to breathe. Here's one tip on the trauma-informed care, right? If we could do this with every youth that we come in contact with, if we could do it with ourselves, with each other, everyone we meet, because we know there's a lot of wounded people out there, right? The grocery store, the counter at the airport. I mean, there's a lot of people who have had a lot of trauma exposure, right? So we never know what's going on. Applying universal precautions is this: assuming the youth that you work with, just presume that they have been trauma exposed. You all can do that, right? But then the part about applying universal precautions is providing unconditional respect and being very, very careful not to humiliate or shame them in any way, shape, or form, right? Or also not allowing other people. I don't care if it's a judge or if it's a doctor or a social worker. No one should get to shame and humiliate these kids. Shame runs through their bone marrow, and we don't need to press that shame button. So that's part of trauma-informed care. Make them feel good about themselves, because remember, their exploiters have done everything they can to tear them down, right? So they can control them. So if we go to harm reduction. All right. So what's your name? Kelly? Thank you. So you brought this up. That's really good. So Jim really wanted to make sure that we address this. So harm reduction model. Of course we want these kids to be safe and well and healthy, right? But if any of us truly had a magic wand, we would make that happen, but we can't, right? So we have to really embrace this thing called harm reduction. And we should anyhow, because if we want them to be able to take care of themselves when they're not with us or other helpers, I mean, that's ultimately what we want, right? So empowering youth by offering a support system that allows them to control and make their own positive decisions, and then space to safely see the outcomes of these decisions, even if some potentially bad things happen, right? It's got to be their choice. You can give them information, which you want to do, right? But ultimately, it's their decision. Harm reduction for youth means meeting a youth where they are at, not where you want them to be. That is so critical, isn't it? Because if we push, we manipulate, we threaten, we intimidate, try to push them along, well, I think you should be here, and they're over here, then we're not respecting who they are and their own journey, right?
Paula, you had a discussion over here where you're talking about, okay, you want to give them certain information, what are they going to retain, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I know that from an outreach worker perspective, you're thinking, okay, what pitch do I make? What service do I refer them to? Keeping in mind that, you may not even be passing out that brochure. You may not be telling them about a shelter referral. If you figure out that all they really want to do is socks, you give them socks, And, if someone turns to me and says, that's your job, you just gave out socks, you didn't even tell them about a shelter, you didn't even tell them about a drop-in center, the response should be, no, that's not where that youth was at. That's not what they were going to hear. I need to figure out what they are going to hear, what they're interested in, and keeping in mind that, particularly from a harm reduction standpoint, your interaction with that youth, that one interaction, is not going to be the thing that helps that youth get safe and get stable. You're going to be part of a larger thing, and that can allow you to focus on those little, really important things that you need that might set up the next worker, and that worker has a chance to talk about the shelter, but may never have had the chance to talk about shelter if you hadn't taken care of socks and earned that tiny bit of trust. So really looking at this from a harm reduction standpoint, when you combine harm reduction with trauma-informed care, we really got to focus on the little things. We know that in our hearts we're focused on ultimately these youth being safe and stable and out of harm's way, but also recognizing that for our role, we may not be in a position to see that happen right now. Let's figure out what the best thing that we can do for this youth is, and sometimes it's that simple thing. Here, have some clean underwear, granola bars, and if you're working in a shelter, maybe it's just, hey, you know what? You pissed at me, told me to F off. Tell you what, I'm going to let that go and let you chill out, rather than actually having that, that conversation about how we really should be treating each other with respect and stuff like that. Sometimes that conversation, it's not the point right now. Maybe what that youth needs to hear is, I'm not going to be able to destroy this relationship just by telling you to F off. That's a pretty big step.
It's huge. And that will bring them, that keeps the door open. We always want to keep the door open, right? So if they can say, what I really need is socks, and that's all they want and what they need, that's pretty good. There's hidden resilience in that, right? Thank you for letting me know specifically. When you think about your own friends, your family, the people you go to who are the wise, sage people, the wisdom folks, right? My guess is the ones that are the go-to people are the ones that will listen to you first and say, what do you need from me? Instead of, well, I think you should blah, 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 right? It's the, what do you need from me right now? How can I best support you? So that's the harm reduction. Okay, so I'm buzzing through all these. You're going to have them on your It's on the website, or it will be on the website.
Will be on the website.
Okay.
You'll be able to draw this down from the Streetworks website. You'll be able to pull up the PowerPoint. You could do this training yourself.
Yeah. Yeah,
Eventually.
you could. I know you could. Many of you could. So I'm going to end on this point. The more you can learn about teaching youth how to manage the strong emotions they have, that's really an important skill for you all to learn, so you can teach it when the moment comes up, like this might be a good time to teach them about breathing, or a mindfulness practice of closing their eyes and imagine, whatever, you know what I mean? Learn what you can, and that's what you want to do. So I just want to end by saying, first of all, thank you. And I started out saying that you are human beings, we are human beings in this room, right? So I'm going to end with a mindfulness practice. Some of you have already seen this. So I invite you to, you don't have to, and there won't be any judgment if you choose not to. So I want you to stand up, please. Again, you don't have to. And I want you to stand with your feet about hip width apart. I want you to stand up tall. Think about if you watch the Olympics like I do, you see those athletes standing at the podium, and they are tall and they are proud and they're strong, right? So this is actually from Harvard Business School did this research on this. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to assume the superhero pose. Remember some of you probably remember Wonder Woman, right? The fists on the hips, standing up strong, your shoulders are down, they're back, your head is up high, right? This is a superhero pose. So I want you to stay in this pose while I tell you about this research. So they did research on Harvard business students, and they found that just 2 minutes standing in the superhero pose reduced the cortisol levels significantly. So cortisol is one of those hormones that when we're really anxious or nervous or that kind of thing, right? So it reduced the stress hormone cortisol. The other thing it did is it boosted, just in 2 minutes, it boosted the person's feeling of confidence. So while you are not superhuman, you are superheroes for the work that you do and for caring about these youth. So I want to acknowledge you for that, and I want to say thank you for everything that you do for these youth who have experienced a lot of harm in their lives. So thank you, each and every one of you, for what you do. Pat yourselves on the back, give yourself a hand. Thank you very much.